Hello everyone, good evening. Good evening and welcome. What a pleasure to be in the warmth of this bookstore on a cold February night. My name is Thomas Wisniewski. I teach literature and literary translation at Harvard in the Department of Comparative Literature, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the work of three remarkable translators who are with us this evening, seated in the front row: Alex Braslavsky, Marguerite Feitlowitz, and Danielle Pieratti. All three have published very recent translations, hot off the press, which will be available for purchase later this evening. A brief word about the publisher. There's a wonderful nonprofit press that published these three translations by the name of World Poetry Books, which is a leader in publishing beautiful, skillful, and sensitive translations of poetry, which I think we will experience firsthand this evening. According to Grolier's tradition, we'll go in alphabetical order, beginning with Alex Braslavsky. Alex is a poet, translator, scholar, and doctoral candidate in Harvard's Slavic Department. She writes scholarship on Russian, Polish, and Czech poetry. Her poems appear and are forthcoming in the Columbia Review, Conjunctions, and Colorado Review. Tonight, she will read from her 2023 translation of poems by Zuzanna Ginczanka, which has just come out and is titled On Centaurs and Other Poems. Born in Ukraine in 1917 to a Russian-speaking Jewish family, Ginczanka wrote her poems in Polish, beginning when she was only 4 years old. Alex's translation opens with a poem written when Ginczanka was only 14, titled Holiday Feast, which I hope we'll hear shortly, and closes with the late poems written before the poet's untimely death in May 1944, when she was shot in the Palisade concentration camp. In spite of a life cut short, Ginczanka is a poet whose work lives on in Polish and indeed in translation. Please welcome Alex Braslavsky, who will read from her beautiful new edition.
Hi everyone.
Hi. Hello.
Thank you to Grolier for having me. This is a book of Ginczanka's poetry that I translated through the pandemic and through the beginning of the Russian war on Ukraine. And for me, Ginczanka has been a touchstone of faith during these times, and I wanted to acknowledge that today is the anniversary of Russia's attack on Ukraine and just take a moment of silence first before reading. Gramatyka. A wrosnąć słowa tak radośnie, a pokochać słowa tak łatwo. Trzeba tylko wziąć je do ręki i obejrzeć, jak płyną pod światło. Przymiotniki przyciągają się jak koty i jak koty są stworzone do pieszcząt. Miękkie koty, ciepłe i potulne, mruczą tkliwość, andante i majosto. Miękkie koty mają w oczach jeziora i żel topiel wodorosną na dnie. Patrzę senie w źrenice kocie, tajemnicze i szklane i zdradne. Oto jest bryła i kształt. Oto jest treść nieodzowna. Konkretność istoty rzeczy, materia wkuta w rzeczownik i nieruchomość świata i spokój martwot i stałość. Coś, co trwa wciąż i jest słowo stężone w ciało. Oto są proste stoły i twarde drewniane ławy. Oto są wątłe i mokre z tkanek roślinnych trawy. Oto jest rudy kościół, co w Bogu gotykiem sterczy. I oto jest zimne, tętnicze, ludzkie, najprostsze serce. Zaś przysłowek to nagły cud, niespodzianka potartych sieciw. Było coś nie wiadomo jak, a już teraz jest skos i poprzek. Oburąż oplata myszą i jest pewnie, rzewnie i dobrze. A zajęki to malutkie pokoiczki, gdzie na oknach rosną małe doniczki. Każdy kącik to pamiątka po dawniej, a są tylko dla ciebie i dla mnie. Tu tajemną abracadabrą kwitną prawa miłośnych algebr. Ja to ty, ty to ja, równanie. Ja bez ciebie, ty beze mnie, to zero. My lubimy otuleni z mieszkami, w małych słowach jak w szufladkach szperać. Ja to ty, ty to ja, równanie. A zajęki są tak tajne jak kwiaty, jak malutkie pokoiczki, w których mieszkasz w tajemnicy przed światem. Więc weź tylko słowo do ręki i obejrzyj, jak burgund pod światło, a wrosnąć w słowa tak radośnie, a pokochać słowa tak łatwo. Grammar. And grow into words so joyfully, and love words so easily. You just have to pick them up and look, like burgundy against the light. Adjectives stretch like cats, and like cats are made for petting. Soft cats, warm and docile, purr, tenderness andante and maestoso. Soft cats have lakes in their eyes, and green deep weed, herbaceous at the bottom. I look sleepily into the cat's pupils, secret and glass and deceptive. Here is shape and form. Here is the indispensable essence, the concreteness of the essence of the thing, material embedded in a noun, and the world's immobility and the peace of deadness and stability, something that lasts still and is a word concentrated in the body. Here are simple tables and hard wooden benches. Here their fibrous tissues are thin and wet grasses. Here is a ginger church which protrudes with the Gothic in God. And here is the Venus, arterial, simplest human heart. Whereas an adverb is a sudden miracle, a surprise of rubbed flints, there was something no one knows how, and now it is diagonal and across. And with both hands it wraps the thought, and it is surely sad and good. And pronouns are tiny little rooms where on windowsills grow small pots. Each corner a souvenir from the past, and they are only for you and for me. This is a secret abracadabra. Laws of the love algebras are flourishing. I, that's you. You, that's me. Equation. I without you. You without me. That's zero. We love, enveloped by twilights, searching in small words as in dresser drawers. I, it's you. You, it's me. Equation. And pronouns are as secret as flowers, like tiny, tiny rooms in which you live in secret before the world. So just take the word in your hand and look, like burgundy against the light, and grow into words so joyfully, and love words so easily. Ginczanka wrote that poem when she was 16, and it made her nationally famous in Poland, and it was the poem, one of the poems at the heart of her first and only collection that she published when she was 19 called On Centaurs. Which I'd like to read now, the eponymous poem of that collection. Okay, before that, I'll read this other poem she wrote when she was 16 to give a sense of how unabashedly bloody and aggressive she could be in her poetry and sensual, and how much metallic friction she had in her work, and how fierce she was for being so young in her poetry. So this is called the same age, right, as the other poem, a 1933 poem, Ascension of the Earth. Pull down, tear down, crush clouds like a flabby cicatrix. Let the sun melt you, burn you with heat. Pull down, tear off your faces indifferently hypocritical, shriek rather hatred most red-hued and cruelty. Spread out, destroy, bite the world to a pulp. Unload yourselves in vortices and swirl as whirlpools. Everything suppressed in blood, burst into foam. Tear up the rosary of prayers. Weave in sincerity like a dance. Choke on the froth, on what life has given you. In your own fire, burn yourselves, and with your truth infect the globe. The fat earth is most fertile. It will whistle for eternity. It will throw a track around the sun and begin to shake the stars. It will rage free of river, forest, and fields, and in the fires of its own blood, fall down and worship to God. Slavery, humility of love, the quietest, the plainest, the simplest. September 6, 1933. On Centaurs. Sharpened verses, rhyme to rhyme, rub against each other with a chatter. Trust not the narrow faculties, lest anyone possess you. Trust not fingers like the blind, nor eyes like handless owls. Here I preach passion and wisdom, tightly conjoined at the waist like a centaur. I profess the dignified harmony of a masculine torso and head, with the exuberant body of a stallion and thin hock of its leg, to the cold feminine cheeks and napes of rotund mares. They gallop majestically, the centaurs, in horseshoe bells from meadows of mythology, their passion focused and wise, and their wisdom smoldering like rapture. I found in a harmony dignified, and I alloyed them in waist and heart. Take a gander, a reflection of an ancient face, entrusted its divinity to flushed horses, and quivering senses rush through June, like trammeled steeds across the Arnica. Ginczanka was very interested in mythological creatures, and one of the things I realized while translating her work was that we were creating this double-headed hydra together. We were a dual-headed author, which was a very spiritual kind of twining. Another interesting aspect of her work is she made a lot of neologisms, and I started to realize over time that those words that she was making up were small creatures. They were word centaurs. This poem opens with one of her most famous lines. The line is Nie upilnuje mnie nikt po polsku. In English, I have it as nobody will police me. That's the opening line. And her biography written by Isolde Kitsch is titled that. It's called Betrayal. Nobody will police me. Sin of suede and bats, hung in attics of fear with a half-mouse head to the ground. At dusk, I sneak out of the tower. I escape the fortified tower through the cutting of sharp wasps, through the barricade of poisonous herbs. Heavily, they rise from debris, shaping the crags of commandments, 20 Vedic hells, flames, an ululation, and whiz, a fanatical night will threaten, throw stars as stones. I'll slip as mercury through fingers. Nothing will police me. You will turn into a wolf, I into a wagtail, you into an eagle, and I in the winding Oz. With impenetrable intention, I will anticipate your every pursuit. The world will not police me. Oh darling, oh dear, oh my sweet. If I myself don't want sweet May's fidelity. And I think for the last poem, I'd like to read her Non Omnis Moriar, which is the last poem we have of hers. She wrote it in 1942. She passed in January of 1944, just as the war was ending. There are probably other poems of hers, just haven't been found. This poem is famous because she addresses her accusers, the people who turned her into the shupo in this poem. And there are many beautiful variants of this poem, so I encourage people to look at many translations of it. Here's mine. Non omnes moriar, my proud domain. Meadows of tablecloths, strongholds of closets, staunch, sheets endless, precious linen fabrics and dresses, bright dresses will remain after me. I will not leave a single heir behind. So may your hand fish through Jewish things, you, Mrs. Homine of Lvov, gutsy wife of a snitch, quick informer, mother of a Volksdeutscher. May these things serve you and yours. What good would they do strangers? My dears, I pass on no loot, no empty name. I remember you just as you, when the shupo came, thought of me. Even reminded them of me. Let my friends sit down to a chalice and drink to their wealth at my burial. Tapestries and rugs, platters, candles, may they drink the night long, and at the break of dawn may they rummage for precious stone and gold. Amid the sofas, mattresses, quilts, and carpets. Oh, how the work will burn easy in their hands. Clumps of horsehair and seagrass, clouds of pillows torn, and puffs of feathers cling to their hands, turning both arms to wings, and the fresh down, binding with my blood, swiftly turns them to winged angels.
Thank you, Alex, for that beautiful reading. We will have Q&A at the end of the reading tonight, so we will welcome your questions then. Next, I'd like to introduce Marguerite Feitlowitz, who is a writer, translator, scholar, and professor of literature and translation at Bennington College, where she teaches literature, writing, and is the founding director of Bennington Translates, which brings acclaimed literary, humanitarian, and scholarly translators to campus, and sponsors Mother Tongues, which is a student-centered website publishing multilingual, multicultural literary art and performance pieces. Marguerite has published extensively. I'll name a few of her volumes in translation in French and Spanish, including Small Bibles for Bad Times, Selected Prose and Poetry by Lillian Adlan, 2021. Pillar of Salt, an autobiography with 19 erotic sonnets by Salvador Novo, and 2 volumes of plays by Griselda Gambaro. She is the author of the internationally acclaimed A Lexicon of Terror, Argentina and the Legacies of Torture, and has held 2 Fulbright fellowships to Argentina. Tonight, Marguerite will read from her 2022 translation of Night by the Chilean poet Ennio Moteldo, which was supported by the National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellowship. Ennio Moteldo was a native of Valparaiso, was born in 1931 and died in 2012. He is for Raúl Zurita, whom Marguerite quotes in her beautifully written introduction to Moteldo's work, and I quote from Zurita, one of the finest, greatest, most curious and honorable poets of Chile. If he is not better known, it is because poetry far exceeds the times of our human lives. La Noche is a collection of 113 prose poems written during and in response to the Pinochet regime and not published until 1999. Given Moteldo's admiration of Dante and his Italian ancestry, Marguerite, I think, rightly suggests that we can read La Noche as his own Inferno, for which I cannot help but quote from the very last 113th prose poem in Marguerite's evocative translation. We wait for them on the blue shore, let them come from every corner, reg sellers, cure sellers, wandering tale-tellers, ad runners, errand runners, the shamefaced, the abased, and etc. The sea washes them naked and carries away the slime. Those words I turn to our translator. Please welcome Marguerite.
Oh my goodness. Alex, that was extraordinary. So powerful. And I think I can speak for, well, I'll just do it, speak for Ennio Moteldo, who really would have resonated with what you read. So, thank you. It is really a joy to be here, literally physically surrounded by poetry. It's wondrous, and so thank you, and it's wonderful to see so many beloved and familiar faces and new faces too. So, I'll read some French, not French, I will not read French. I will read some Spanish and some English. You'll know which is which because I'll pair them closely. So I want to say one thing that Tom has mentioned. This is a book of 113 prose poems. Moteldo wrote a first book in verse, in lines, and then after it was published, he delineated everything he ever wrote and never again wrote in verse. What he did with a prose poem is really interesting. Sometimes they're very lyric, sometimes they're like microfiction, sometimes they're vignettes, sometimes they are really surreal, like dream texts. He does this all with controlled rage a lot of the times. This was a book that he wrote, as Tom said, during and against the Pinochet dictatorship, but he didn't publish it in Chile until 1999, once democracy had returned. And this is the first English translation, and I'm thrilled to be published by World Poetry Books. So, 1. At what time must the birds lined up in garden, trees, and cages sing? Look to the law. 1. ¿A qué hora deben cantar los pájaros formados en el jardín, en árboles o jaulas? Lea la ley. 2. Let's appoint the village madman, Chief Justice on the Court of Appeals, with a vote and veto and seat at the table, a sane example to the debating powers that be and the people who in their hours of contemplation rest in chairs set out on the sidewalk when twilight bloodies the screen with scrolls and pictures to make us believe that, of course, here it is, the disgusting, fleshy finale. Let's appoint the village madman. 7. Definitive sentences do not appear in these pages unless they were previously published in the newspaper of record, as the law decrees, and horizons vanish. 10. Si pones el oído sobre la tierra desnuda, escucharás claramente el nombre de los asesinos. 10. If you put your ear to the naked earth, you will precisely hear the murderers' names. 11. Can we go on like this? Wherever one goes, on a walk, to work, to the desert, to the seashore, a hollow, a shelter, any place in the shade, there's a message, a sign at the foot of the column, in official gardens, among trees, even in ponds and underwater currents, in the tunnel, yes, under the bridge, in the office of the district attorney. By all the evidence, from every one of our pores, we are birthing the half-dressed dead. Me han enviado al fondo del mar, sin oxígeno, por supuesto, en traje de calle y con sobre azul en mano. 12. They have sent me to the bottom of the sea, without oxygen, of course, in street clothes, with blue envelope in hand. And here's the title poem. 15. Noche, from the Latin nox, from the Greek nitos, descended in turn from the Sanskrit nakta. In German one says Nacht, in English night, Portuguese noite, in French nuit, in Catalan nit, in Walloon nuita, in Chile night is eternal. 21. Once you've been thrown out in good riddance, you can't go back home. Even when out of sight and out of mind, you set out again as an old man to go back to the place that gave you comfort, the country that you called home, because the country you called home has disappeared. 23. It's easy. Plowing end to end, slitting the country end to end, back and forth, one furrow next to another, like bleachers in the stadium as seen from the air, their traces sinking ever deeper, night and day, until they appear, until we hear their screaming. We're here, my darling, here. 24. El corazón general no late, pero existe. Lo que podemos llamar, en momentos sentimentales, el corazón colectivo no es la suma de los corazones individuales. El corazón general es un artefacto único, y quien lo encuentra puede darse por muerto. 24. The general heart doesn't beat, though it exists. What we can call, in sentimental moments, the collective heart is not the sum total of individual hearts. The general heart is a unique artifact, and whoever finds it can consider himself dead. 49. Good for you, Galileo. You escaped by a hair. Now, in November of 1992, you are officially vindicated. As for our Juan, his case is just getting started. With no papers or proofs, there's no possible hurry. Well, let's hope it doesn't take 500 years. 51. Please, no. Not the full weight of the walk. Where do they come from? The flowers that bloom by the wayside and blossom in the Constitution and always face the same direction. Impossible to resist the white boy's legislation. Impossible, so much weight and so much paving over. To tell you the truth, I prefer to sit back and wait for the presidential reckoning, the early and definitive iterations, all the usual music on which, they say, the very air at this time of year depends. I prefer a carillon concert, or the same old movie shown on the clear channel of the fog. But the whole weight of the law? No, not here. The children are sleeping. Leave something for the moment we pack the truck, for the night of bags and bundles, for our escape, but also for the weekend, in the sun, with the memory of friends. These things are not to be gambled with. 62. Giving and taking. I hold out to you a certificate of good conduct, and you make your confession. You whisper in my ear, where they are to be found. There will be no reports in the press, and no discussion in front of the children. All quiet. What is not known does not exist. But you will be comforted to know that in the future, the surprise can be repeated as many times as may be necessary. As many times as may be necessary. 66. Un esqueleto más, quedaré hablando solo, comprando huesos, tocando la flauta, el tambor con huesos, presentando materiales, plantaciones, viveros, hasta el día de la cosecha y la gran exportación de tallos y huesos. 66. One more skeleton and I'll be left talking to myself, buying bones, playing the flute, playing the drums, with bones, pointing the way to fields, plantations, and nurseries until the day of the harvest and the great exportation of stamps and bones. 71. Impossible, Kay, to enter the castle. The castle has no name, no owner, and is always empty. Even so, we must strive for the sky, realm of the scintillating promise, freedom. So before I read the last two poems, I just want to say, this is the book, and the reason I want to show you this is that the volume physically is completely Chileno. The cover art is by Nemesio Antunes. The typography is designed in Chile. All the letters are designed in Chile. It was printed in Lithuania, but that's the only exception. But I love the honor that was done to the origin of these poems, that physically so much of it is Chilean. So two more poems. 92. ¿Y qué haremos con todo el amor acumulado en países lejanos? Devolución de cenizas. 92. And what shall we do with all the love accumulated in distant countries? Return the ashes. And this is the final poem in the book. 113. Los esperamos en la orilla azul. Vengan de todos los rincones. Vengan traperos, santeras, gitanos, mendicantes, cuenteros, promocionantes, mandaleros, vergonzantes, pedigüeños, etc. El mar los desnuda y se lleva la mugre. 113. We wait for them on the blue shore. Let them come from every corner. Rag sellers, cure sellers, wandering tale tellers, ad runners, errand runners, the shamefaced, the abased, and etc. The sea washes them naked and carries away the slime. Thank you.
Thank you, Marguerite, for that beautiful reading. Last, I'd like to introduce Danielle Pieratti. She's a poet, translator, and teacher. She's the author of the poetry collections Approximate Body, forthcoming from CMU Press in 2023, and Fugitives, Lost Horse Press in 2016. Danielle is the winner of the Idaho Prize and the Connecticut Book Award for Poetry, and a finalist for the Hudson Prize and the Autumn House Poetry Prize. Danielle's collections include the chapbooks The Post, The Cage, The Palisade, and Edda chapbook winner By the Dogstar, Sarasota Poetry Theatre Press, 2005. Tonight, Danielle will read from Transparencies, a beautiful translation of poetry by the contemporary Italian poet Maria Borio, which was just published by World Poetry Books in 2022. Maria Borio is the author of two collections of poetry, Transparencies, 2019, and L'altro limite, 2017. Borio is also the poetry editor of the journal Nuovo Argomenti. By way of introduction to this poet's remarkable work, I'd like to read, if I may, only the beginning of an evocative poem, which I hope we might soon hear from Danielle in the Italian and in Danielle's beautiful translation. The poem is titled Dorso Duro, and I'll read the first part of that poem. Dorso Duro, 1. Le case sull'acqua avranno solidità, ma gli occhi intorno non sono umani. Tra atmosfera e atmosfera tutto si trasforma. Un suono umano e disumano. Dorso Duro, 1. The houses on the water will stand firm, but the eyes around them aren't human. Atmosphere to atmosphere, everything transforms. The human sound is inhuman. Please welcome Danielle Pieratti.
Thank you, Thomas, so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here and to Grolier for hosting this wonderful event. I feel thrilled to be reading with these other fantastic translators. I was sort of piqued my interest when you mentioned, Alex, that you translated through the pandemic, because I was also translating this book through the pandemic, and I feel like the book itself was written just before, and so then translating it during the pandemic, it kind of gives it both qualities, the pre-pandemic and the pandemic quality, and I think that it's interesting to think about sort of how those two perspectives come into tension. Really, the book is about perspective, and the title, Transparencies, in Italian, it's Trasparenza, kind of speaks to Borio's interest in transparent surfaces, glass, water, mirrors, but also often screens, so the screens that we see each other through that allow us to communicate but can also distort. And so the first poem I'm going to read is called Aquatic Center, and it's a poem that I think kind of gives an introduction to Borio's perspective. It was inspired by the Aquatic Center in London, which was completed by Zaha Hadid Architects in 2011, which is a very sort of architecturally interesting glass building with a lot of transparent surfaces. I'll read this one in Italian first, and then I'll read the remaining poems just in English. Aquatic Center. Stesa sul letto, a volte vedi forme, curve che entrano e spirali che evadono. Gli organi trasparenti in alto si aprono e diventano una linea morbida che insegue se stessa, pulisce il respiro dai colori scuri, il colore del sangue o quello denso della carne dove nascono le api. Nulla si rigenera, ma è prolungato, infinito nella linea che pulisce gli oggetti e fa cose per pensare, per abitare. Un grande uovo, ad esempio, si spacca senza perdere liquido e bianchissimo, invade gli angoli del soffitto, apre un arco, una porta fra i continenti. Tra il cielo e l'acqua questo edificio splende in una luce illimitata. Puoi aprirlo, aprirti a una lingua di toni aspri, tornare nel suono rotondo di un'altra, riprendendo quei toni come finestre sul mare, o il ponte sospeso per il parco, dove le persone stese sull'erba sono api, e il calore al sole sembra impedire la morte, anche se tra anni, milioni, un giorno esplorendo. Segui poi altre linee, quelle della specie, forse come sapere che nascere non sarà più violenza, ma fenomeno di sguardo, e dal letto lasci il sesso arrampicarsi attorno ai contorni di questo edificio, nel suo bianco sotto raggi sen tempesta, la stella nell'attimo prima di esplodere. La vita è ovunque, in una linea curva, ognuno abita come pensare. Le api ora lasciano la mia bocca perché le penso. Aquatic Center. Stretched out on the bed, you see shapes, curves that enter and spirals that evade. The transparent organs overhead open, become a soft line chasing itself, cleansing the breath's dark colors, the color of blood, or that depth of flesh where bees breathe. Nothing regenerates, but all is prolonged, infinite in the line that cleans objects and makes things to think and habit. A huge egg, for example, breaks without spilling, and whiteness fills the angles of the ceiling, opens an arch, a door between continents. Between sky and water, this building shines an endless light. You could open it, open yourself to a tongue of harsh tones, return to the other's round sleep, finding again tones like windows on the sea, or the suspension bridge over the park where people stretched on the grass are bees, and the sun's warp wards off death. Even if in years, millions, one day it explodes. You follow those other lines of species, as though knowing to be born won't be violence, but a phenomenon of gaze. And from the bed you let sex crawl the contours of this building, in its white under storm rays, the star just before it explodes. Life is everywhere, in the curved line we inhabit as though thinking. Now, as I think of them, the bees leave my mouth. The second poem I'm going to read has a similar is in a similar vein to this one, and it's titled Isola. Slightly more concrete, I would say, than the previous poem, and it's referencing a neighborhood in Milan called Isola. It's changed quite a bit from how it was prior, but it now has a lot of sort of glass high-rise buildings and metal. So this is called Isola. At night, Isola's high-rise glass seems a fault on the horizon, a half circle of building that commands the power to make water solid, then liquefy at the moment you're done circumscribing. Here, the hours distinguished by dark, the tidy silence, the rumble of trains, drops in the air, fibers, but the dawn halts us in contorted sound. The curves of empty time, the tunnel escape, elevators, defrosted food, and open charge between them, the architects of this glass neatness, or a human attempt to still the fragilest blue. Seated on the fountain's edge, here's the takeover. Incorruptible, the cold of dark shrinks back, and the usual crowd scales the face's lines. At the cafe, you tell me it's a metaphor for our world, hoarding food in its mouth, the huge glass of these buildings and the food organ deep, machine and flesh toil invisible, and their imperfection wraps pure and impure, entering, exiting from the huge glass that's cut into sections like a mute, obscure Duchamp. If you squeeze your hand, it could break, or resist as the ether resists, and there, self-conscious or self-removed, pure and impure, Isola's vast screen, or a continent. I'm going to read a couple of poems. One of the things that emerged in sort of the translation, and this is just to think about the title, Transparencies or Transparents, with respect to translation, because as we know, translation is never transparent, right? And that's sort of what she's speaking to in terms of screens and glass and sort of communication, and I think really simultaneity is the word I'm looking for. But one thing that emerged when I chose poems for this collection that wasn't really present in the larger collection, which is a much longer book that she wrote in Italian, was the influence of nature and natural imagery that sort of contrasts with and creates tension with some of these very sort of contemporary glass and metal and computerized images. So I'll start by reading Dorsoduro, which is one of my favorites, and this again references a neighborhood in Venice. Dorsoduro. 1. The houses on the water will stand firm, but the eyes around them aren't human. Atmosphere to atmosphere, everything transforms. A human sound is inhuman. 2. They resist water plants. We imagine they reach us from a nucleus deep within. The garden is balanced without atmosphere. Its reflection on the water is a summary of light across a city that, though fish-shaped, flows with a nature neither animal nor vegetable. Now Papadopoli makes invisible energy, balance hanging between atmospheres. This garden has no nature. It's not a garden. Is this balance on water real balance? 3. Evil is hidden by the fog on the sea. A hook brings it forward and back. At night we get lost on this bank. The lights oscillate on our shoulders. We're no longer human, but sound that stitches Dorsoduro to the ghetto. The motors write the water densely. Now a fixed silence in the real delivered. More poem that sort of takes water and thinks of how water as a transparent surface sort of conveys and distorts. This is called Riverbed. The green light of the river, the pink of the mountains, crosses the apartment north to south, south to north. A soft strip of chalk that opens, contains. You try to distinguish the rising voices from the scales of iridescent water. How sincere these languages, fragments with few consonants, closed vowels, black equatorial rhythmic drums through sycamore branches. For each language, a scale of water thrust from window to mountain in disarming union. The rock circle amplifies. The city is a stadium, this house its eardrum, we inside it pulling out the roots of words like hooked fish. What haven't we learned? What that's stronger, unwritten? A sudden burst in the river, the radium that makes the riverbed shimmer. Open vowels muddle in the grass. Closed vowels rouse dust and motors. We close our eyes. Here are all the scales, broken sounds drawn in. The river returns to its place, the mountain to its place. If we remain silent, we conduct. Tongues, knotted rings, electricity, people now on a riverbed strangely illuminated. So I think I'll read 2 more. Creatures. 1. Nothing more fragile, nothing more simple. Time gets lost if I believe we'll have time to count all the forms of happiness. On the screen, I follow pictures of the ocean. It divides us. It's cold. At every veering of birds, your body and mine might be transformed. Tonight, the ocean touched your belly because you dreamed it. A strange Europe caressed my back. I press my face, the shape of your face, 2 hemispheres. 2. Creatures, traces of fire. On the wall you made the first marks. I thought you a braid in the flame that opens violet, falls layer by layer. We pass through time like icons on the painting's timeless background. Creatures who cannot say they conquer you. And the last poem I'll read is one that I think kind of brings together a lot of the sort of themes that are in the book, themes of digital communication, transparency, screens, and also nature and how to reconcile nature, the natural world, and the past within that. This is called Letter 6 a.m. For the moment that divides night from day, you stayed in the open, in the high blue grass. Your eyes wrote it into some space, and the camera lens captured her, naked and thin, what life wants to appear. If you write down a moment, does it grow? Slowly the writing's room reaches the life of others, and this photograph, like a real mouth, more than real, already would make them ask where you are, at what time, why you gather the pale sky between azure stems. Maybe this last bit of summer could speak itself if it reproduced by moving, if it resembled lives on video that appear, long to feel similar. Neolithic men retold with the palms of their hands on the walls of caves, and the outlines of their hands were protection, light that lives. See my letters this way. I stick my hands on the bluish pink, on the thorniest mouth, the naked woman who compresses an exodus, crushing her hands on the rock. Unarmed lives continue the hunt in the recorded voice, in the photo that erases the voice, in the letters that erase the body. On the low wall, you sit and listen again to the sound of the video that writes where I am, the hour, the why. The voice is a cold nude who presses her hands to the sky. Thank you so much.
I want to thank Danielle, Marguerite, and Alex for what a beautiful reading of these remarkable translations. We do have time for Q&A, so we welcome questions from the audience. Yes?
Yeah, I'm real curious as to how each of you found your poets and at what point you decided to translate them.
You guys want to go back up there? That way the people on Zoom can see too.
In 2019, the full collected volume of Ginczanka's poetry was released in Poland. And I was in my master's and I was learning Polish, and Kasia Szymanska, who was running a translation seminar where I was studying, showed me her poetry. And then it just started out as a fun project. I never thought I would turn into a translator or anything. It was just really beautiful poetry, and I was trying to engage with this beautiful language. So that's how I got into this.
So I actually feel like Maria's work kind of fell into my lap by kismet. Marco Sonzogni, who's an Italian translator and scholar in Australia, sent the name of a few Italian poets that he thought were interesting to Peter Constantine, actually, and he relayed them to me. And when I read Maria's work, I immediately felt like I connected with it, felt like I could translate it. And that's really important for me because I actually think that I wouldn't translate, so I'm not the translator that would translate, everything. I translated this work because I felt like I could. I felt like I could hear it in English. I felt like it resonated with my work. And so that's sort of how I was introduced to her and started translating her.
Well, continuing the theme of serendipity, I had never heard of Ennio Mortadelo. I was in Santiago de Chile for a Human Rights and Culture conference, and I wandered into a bookshop, and I had a list of Argentine novels that I wanted to buy, and I had, done a pretty good job of assembling them, and then behind me came a very low, robust voice saying, basta con la narrativa argentina, estás en Chile, país de poetas. Enough of the Argentine narrative, you're in Chile, land of poets. And then he said, sentate. In the familiar, no less, sentate. And so I sat. And the bookseller, whose name was Jorge Rosmarie, who was himself a publisher, an editor, and a poet, and a yoga teacher, brought me book upon book of Chilean poetry. And Moltedo Night, La Noche, was, high up, and I opened it, and I just knew. It was just like, that's what it was. I just had to. And so that was, that's how it happened. So I'm a big believer in chance encounters.
This question is largely for Alex, so I guess it applies to everyone. In your incredibly beautifully written introduction, you describe Ginczanka's lines as coagulated, which I thought was a beautiful phrase. And it reminded me that when you were talking about that spiritual entwinement that you referenced in your opening, and I was wondering if you could just talk about that spiritual entwinement. Is it something that's restricted purely to the pen, or did you feel that it went beyond that at a certain point?
Wow. So, I think I connected with her like she was my sister during this translation process, and that's why I couldn't stop translating her work, because it was, at first I was translating on centaurs, but then I went back to the poem she wrote as a child, and it was mostly from their chronological, and it was a big onrush of poetic prowess, basically, over time. And as somebody who wrote poetry as a child and has written poetry since then, it kind of was like retracing somebody's steps, but also retracing mine. But obviously that's a big thing to say, because Ginczanka is just so powerful. And then I finished the book, sent it in for publication around the time of my 28th birthday. She died when she was 28 years old. And I felt not happy about submitting a book on, it just didn't feel right, but it also felt right, and that's kind of what translating feels like. It doesn't feel right. You're literally splicing your body to be with somebody else for a long time, and it also feels right, more appropriate than just being stuck in your body forever until you die. Does that help me answer your
I have a question for Marguerite, and it has to do with what we were discussing just before the reading. And the differences you found between Argentine Spanish and Chilean Spanish, given that you've published quite a bit on Argentina, you've lived in Argentina, you've lectured and taught in Argentina. How is it to cross the Chilean border to work with Chilean poetry? And was that a challenge at all in the translation or not?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it was actually quite a large challenge. Not so much vocabulary. The problem vocabulary you can always solve, pretty much, right? It was the subtler things, the rhythms and the textures. Argentine Spanish conjugates verbs differently, so and uses different pronouns, and so just the texture of the language is different. The other thing that I would say that was there are also like some of the encoded language, and Monteiro loves to play with legal language, bureaucratic language, military language, and that some of that language is very particular to Chile, right? And so I had to learn that. I think what was really challenging, and I was having trouble figuring out why it was so, what it was, what the problem was, and I kept saying to a colleague who's a Chilean specialist, he's just so concise, and he said, no, he's curt. And I thought, wow, and that was a huge, that was so helpful. And you know, the difference may seem like it's small, but it isn't. I would also say there's so much controlled rage in the poetry, and he uses obscenity maybe once, and it is an obscenity that is so full of moral revulsion. Monteiro hates vulgarity, and for him, he hates cowardice, he hates complicity, he hates betrayal, he hates imprecision of sight. He wrote a lot about visual art, so the question of seeing clearly was really important to him on many levels. So there was something, he also wrote a number of poems in one line, which I think are some of the hardest poems to translate. So the difficulties go beyond your question.
Thank you. Well, in that case, another round of applause for our wonderful. Since one books are for sale, please have a look at these beautiful volumes of World Poetry books. And if you could help with the chairs, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.